very excited to feature Linnea Erickson Laskowski as today's presenter. Linnea has been with Safe Passage for 5 years. She's a graduate of Northern Illinois University's Master of Public Administration program and has been working with nonprofits and government agencies in the community since 2011. Welcome, Linnea, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, everyone. I am so glad to be with you today. I also do have my fellow Safe Passage staff member, Mary Beth Finch, who will be joining us in order to keep an eye on the chat box and to answer any questions that anyone might have, or if anyone would feel more comfortable sharing a question or a thought. Privately, you can always send a private message to Mary Beth and she will be watching that. So she's on just to answer any questions or to have any more private chats that anyone would like. So I will go ahead and get started by sharing my screen here, and we will dive in. At any point that you feel like you have a question, a thought, please feel free to jump in the chat or to unmute yourself and share any thoughts as we go through. I know being on Zoom is a completely different world than what we are used to, and certainly very different than the last time that I was doing a training like this with DCNP. So we're all doing our best to make do with interacting in a completely different way. So please feel free to interact in any way that feels best to you. Again, that chat box or unmuting yourself is absolutely fine with me. I would love to answer any questions that you might have. I have my plan for what is important to cover in a sexual harassment training, but I do want to make sure that this is as useful for you all as possible. We know this is a mandatory training, but that doesn't mean that it has to be a slog to get through together. So I really would like to make sure this is helpful in your workplaces. So please feel free to let me know if there are specific questions you have or specific topics that you'd like for me to cover today, and we will dive into this together. So this is the state mandated sexual harassment prevention training that is a requirement for businesses to complete every year for employees as we work together as a state to increase safety in our workplaces and ensure that everyone has a safe and positive work environment. I am from Safe Passage. For those of you who aren't familiar, we are DeKalb County's Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Crisis Center. We serve the entirety of DeKalb County, as well as anyone who is needing services from outside our county. Our services include everything from emergency shelter to long-term counseling, to crisis support in a moment, as well as to legal advice and legal advocacy. So if at any point anything we're talking about is familiar from your previous work experiences, or you are aware of a situation with someone in your circle where someone could benefit from ongoing support, whether that is counseling support to process a previous experience or advice and support with the process of reporting sexual harassment or abuse in a workplace, please feel free to reach out to Safe Passage. I will give you our contact information at the end. All of the services that we provide are always completely free as well as completely confidential. So any questions or concerns that you might have can always be discussed in confidence. And that goes along with if you're observing anything in the workplace and you're wondering what your role is in that situation, you're wondering what you can do, you can always reach out to Safe Passage as well, and we can help you come up with a game plan in those situations for what might be best for you as a bystander to do. So what we're going to start with is just talking a little bit about what harassment looks like, what qualifies as harassment, what really is what we should be looking for in our workplaces. So I want to start with a couple of polls just to get a feel for what you all think harassment might look like in a workplace. So I'm going to put up a list of behaviors, 10 different behaviors. And in the first poll, I'm going to be asking you to select the 3 behaviors that you find most offensive or you think are the worst. The worst cases of sexual harassment or the worst behaviors that you might see in a workplace. And then after we finish that, I'm going to go back and we'll look at that same list again and think of what do we think are the least offensive behaviors in a workplace. So I will go ahead and launch that right now and give you just a little bit to look over that list. And like I said, this is a multiple choice poll, so please select the 3 behaviors that you find most offensive from the list below. I see we've got almost 70% of people having their votes in. I'm going to give you just another 20 seconds or so for everyone who is able to finish that poll. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that down now. I know we don't quite have everyone's answers in, but sometimes that doesn't always work for everyone. Feel free, if you didn't get a chance to get in on that poll, you can always certainly share any thoughts in the chat as well. So it seems like we've got a pretty good split across the different options here. We have about 44% of people who found outing a gay coworker to be one of the most offensive. Just a few people on calling a coworker sweetie or hun. Forced kissing was a pretty commonly selected option as one of the most offensive options. Hanging a sexy fireman calendar in your cubicle got about 4% of people. Asking a subordinate out on a date, about 10% of people. I can just share my results here so you all can see them, so I don't have to read them all individually. Sorry, technology and me are learning each other here. We saw a lot of people, again, a little over 50% thought that moving an employee to a less desirable shift after they declined sexual advances was one of the more offensive options on here. Again, a little over 50% of people who thought that threatening to send nude photos of a colleague to their supervisor was one of the more offensive options. A little over 37% of people, or about 37%, intentionally brushing up against a coworker's body. And then just about 10 of you ranking fellow employees as hot or not in a group chat with friends. So what we're going to do now is, like I said, I'm going to relaunch this a poll, and what I'm asking for this time is that you select the three that you think are maybe not fine, but the least bad of the options on this list. What do we find the least offensive? Again, that doesn't mean that we think it's fine, but it's something that we find to be the least offensive of the options on the list. I do see in the chat someone said I couldn't narrow it down to 3. These are all bad. We'll certainly talk about that at the end. Again, we'll take just another 15 or 20 seconds or so for everyone who is able to get a vote in. All right, I'm seeing we've kind of paused at our number of votes, so I'm going to stop that right there. Thank you to everyone for jumping in on that. We had a much more agreement on this set of what were maybe the least offensive things. Most people agreed that calling a coworker sweetie or hun was maybe one of the lesser offensive options here. Hanging a sexy fireman calendar in your cubicle, asking a subordinate out on a date, and ranking fellow employees as hot or not in a group chat with friends. So what I hope to bring up with this is what someone already noted in the chat, is that it is hard to decide which are the most or the least offensive of these things. And really, when we're looking at what is harassment in the workplace, we're not looking for a list of things that we can or can't do. A lot depends on context in an office place. Calling a coworker sweetie or hun may depend on your connection to them, may depend on whether or not you're in a position of authority over them. It could depend just on how they feel about you calling them that. One person could be fine with it. Another person could find it very offensive. Hanging a sexy fireman calendar in your cubicle may seem like something that's not going to offend anyone or isn't creating a harassing work environment, but if it makes someone else feel uncomfortable, it certainly could be something that contributes not only to someone feeling uncomfortable, but to a lawsuit against the company that you work for. So when we're thinking about what harassment is or isn't in a workplace, we're not looking for a list of rules of what we can and can't do. That's a very reductive idea of how we address harassment in the workplace. What we really want to do is we want to look at how do we make sure people feel safe in our environments? How do we make sure people feel like they can do their best work? How do we make sure people feel valued and accepted in our workplaces and don't feel afraid to come to work or don't feel like they have to change who they are in order to be a valued employee? So when we're thinking about harassment in the workplace, trainings like this are often written off as this is a mandatory thing. We have to do it every year. Let's just get it over with. It's often something that we see in, especially in bigger companies. You see the hokey videos where, it's something straight out of the 80s and it's a really obvious video about how not to touch your coworkers inappropriately. I'm not going to go over that today because we all know that. We all know that you shouldn't force a kiss on a colleague. You shouldn't grab your coworkers behind. You shouldn't make a subordinate feel uncomfortable. I would hope that most of us understand that or know those things already. However, sexual harassment still persists despite decades and decades of these cheesy workplace videos on how to prevent sexual harassment. So what we'll be talking about today is really trying to get at the deeper power dynamics and the deeper attitudes that lead to sexual harassment in the workplace and what we all can do as fellow employees to really prevent workplace harassment. Because what it really comes down to is not just stopping behaviors in ourselves or reporting behaviors in other people. What really works to end harassment in the workplace is for those of us who aren't being harassed or aren't doing the harassing to say something when we see it happening, to be positive bystanders who are going to intervene. So what we're going to be talking about today is much more than just what is legal and what isn't. Of course, we're going to cover that as well because that's part of the legal mandates, but we really want to talk about more than that. We don't want to just think about what could we get sued for? What could I get in trouble for? What could I get arrested for? We really want to move beyond that to how do we create a workplace where everyone feels accepted, where everyone feels supported and valued, and where everyone can do their best work. Because what we know about harassment in the workplace is that it is costly for our businesses. It is costly for our society. It's not only costly in terms of lawsuits and payouts, it's costly in terms of of staff turnover, of having to hire and rehire and hire and rehire and train and bring in new people. It's costly in terms of the value of labor that we're losing from good employees who don't feel comfortable enough to stay in our workplaces. It's costly in terms of the mental health of people who are being harassed or the physical health of people who are being harassed, the medical care that people need to address the issues they're facing in the workplace. So we really want to move beyond just, okay, how do I not get sued? How do I not get arrested? And move into how do we make our workplaces the best they can possibly be? So that's really the angle we're going to be taking today, trying to look at things on a deeper level and really look at what is most effective to make our workplaces safe for everyone. And of course, there is this question of why do we even need this? Like I said, we know that most major corporations have been doing sexual harassment training for decades. We know that sexual harassment is illegal in the workplace. Why do we still need these kinds of training? Why is Illinois mandating this now? Well, because it's not better yet, because we've been doing these trainings for decades and we still really haven't shifted the needle on how do we make sure everyone feels safe in our workplaces. So for anyone who may not be familiar with the Me Too movement, this is a movement that really popped up on social media 3 or 4 years ago with actresses in Hollywood sharing their experiences of sexual harassment in the workplace, especially on film sets in Hollywood. A lot of this was centered around what became a very famous case against Harvey Weinstein, with actresses talking about their experiences with Harvey Weinstein and with other powerful men in Hollywood and feeling very harassed and undervalued at work. And these actresses asked other women to share their stories of sexual harassment in the workplace using the hashtag #MeToo. And what we saw was an explosion of people sharing their stories, not just women, but people of all genders, sharing their stories of being harassed or assaulted in the workplace. And we really started to see how very common that was. And of course, the Me Too movement did not just start with Hollywood actresses talking about Harvey Weinstein. It was a movement that went back more than a decade with activist Tarana Burke, who used this hashtag as a way for young survivors of sexual assault, especially young Black female survivors of sexual assault, to share their story and find a community of support after assault, to know that these things are a problem. And if it has happened to you, you are not alone. There is help out there. There are other people who've had your same experiences. And I think that became, that was very powerful when she started this movement, and very powerful when it exploded again on Twitter just a few years ago. That power in that moment of people seeing this is not an isolated incident. This is not something that has just happened once or twice. This is something that is pervasive, and it is not just an issue in one workplace or in one field. It's not just an issue in Hollywood. It's an issue in almost every field that we can imagine. It's an issue in architecture. It's an issue in the medical field. It's an issue in nonprofits. It's an issue in schools. This is something that crosses all gender lines. It crosses all socioeconomic lines. It crosses all boundaries between different fields and different specialities. This is a problem that we all face. And we clearly are not, even now in the wake of this Me Too movement and this awareness, we're still not getting this as a society. And I know that because I've heard the things people have said after the real movement around Me Too. We've seen a lot of people who say, well, the real problem is that everyone is too sensitive. So here's just a few headlines that illustrate that. The Telegraph in October 2015 said, "Well done, feminism. Now men are afraid to help women at work." The Daily Mail said, "Is hugging still okay? In the wake of the Weinstein sexual assault allegations, men ask, what is acceptable to women in society now?" The Daily Mail again said, "Men do need to recognize that a pat on the butt isn't the innocuous gesture that some might have thought." And The Atlantic said, describing victims of sexual harassment and sexual assault, said, "They're angry and temporarily powerful." So people aren't getting it yet. Even as we've had this moment, even as our society is starting to reckon with how pervasive sexual harassment in the workplace is, there still is this feeling that, well, why do we have to change? There's not really a problem. And I think that comes from a lot of people who haven't been impacted by sexual harassment in the workplace, who don't think, well, it's not a problem for me, so it must not really be a problem. We do need to recognize that as a culture, more than just as individuals, it's not just a problem of Harvey Weinstein's. It's a problem of our culture that doesn't work harder to make sure everyone feels comfortable in our workplaces, that doesn't work to examine the ways that our structures and our systems might not help people to feel truly comfortable. So again, we're going to be looking at a deeper dive here than just what is legal. We're going to be looking at a deeper dive than just, oh, women are complaining about stuff at work these days. We're really going to be looking at how do we make sure everyone feels safe and comfortable at work. So I'm going to play just a quick clip of a video here, pulling up my screen if I can. Oh, here we go. That talks a little bit about how sexual harassment functions in our society and why. And let me make sure I've got my sound on here for you. Okay, here we go.
One of the great challenges in this world is knowing enough about a subject to think you're right.
Now, change begins with a very clear understanding of the problem to be solved. And in this case, the problem to be solved is, why does sexual harassment keep happening? It's been illegal for decades. It's a form of sex discrimination, and the cost to companies and individuals is enormous. So why is it still so pervasive? There are many studies on sexual harassment, but not many of us know about them. And this really concerns me. Because in order to create the kind of change that we need, we must understand this research, understand the root causes, and understand why some companies and some industries have more of a problem with it than others. And this is the research I've come to share with you. And what the research has found is that sexual harassment is more likely to occur in organizations with these 3 characteristics: male-dominated, super hierarchical, and forgiving of bad behavior. Now, it's more common in male-dominated organizations because these environments often have so-called locker room cultures, characterized by aggressive and competitive behaviors, where sexualized talk and crude jokes undermine women and exclude them. In comparison to women, men can have a harder time recognizing when women are being treated in sexist or unfair ways. So all of this sets the stage for sexual harassment, because in these contexts, professionalism can give way to bro-like behaviors, where talk about what happened at the bar last night can mean that women are treated as sexualized pawns and not as valued work colleagues. And if men are less likely to label what other men are doing as inappropriate, this can make things worse. This is also really about dominance. In hypermasculine settings, when women are rising up the ranks, men can feel threatened. In fact, the most common form of sexual harassment is not the solicitation of sex. It's what's called gender harassment. And this is when victims are demeaned by sexist comments, obscene gestures, offensive material like pornography. And what's happening here is not about sexual desire. It's about communicating to women in subtle and not so subtle ways that they don't belong. There is
I'm just talking here without unmuting myself. Sorry about that. So this video, she's speaking in a particular context. She's speaking particularly about harassment to women from men as it is as it's created by unequal gender stereotypes and unequal gender power dynamics in a workplace. And this is important to understand because many of our workplaces have historically been male-dominated fields that make things unsafe for people who are not men. However, that is not the case in every field. And certainly as we have seen gender dynamics change over the decades, we have seen that sexual harassment is not about gender. It's not something that just happens to women from men. It is something that can happen to anyone of any gender. We do see men being sexually harassed by other men or by other women. We see non-binary folks being harassed by cisgender folks. We see women who can be some of the worst sexual harassers as well in a workplace when the power dynamics allow them to be. What I really think is important about what this video shows is that discussion of how much of sexual harassment comes down to power and people using their power to make someone else feel unsafe in a workplace or to make someone else feel like they don't belong. Because sexual harassment absolutely can be about solicitation of sex or can be about sexual assault, and we will talk about that. But more commonly and more often, it is about using that gender discrimination or using sexual situations that make someone feel uncomfortable to make someone feel unwelcome. And also, it is about what the rest of us excuse and what the rest of us allow. Again, sexual harassment doesn't happen because we don't know what sexual harassment is. We've all seen, again, the really old sexual harassment tapes where we're trying to just teach people what's right and wrong. That's not what we need. What we need is to talk about how do we make our workplaces the kind of environments where if someone did something inappropriate, they would not get away with it. They would know that we don't approve of that. How can we create a culture where sexual harassment is not tolerated? That's what really shifts that needle. So I'm going to talk briefly about the legal definitions of sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is any unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or conduct of a sexual nature when submission to such conduct is explicitly or implicitly made a term or condition of employment, and submission to or rejection of the conduct is used as the basis for making decisions about your employment, or such conduct interferes with your job performance or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. So that is a lot of legalese. That is the legal definition. And what that means is that there's two types of sexual harassment. There is sexual harassment where it impacts your job, where getting hired or fired, getting an advancement, getting getting a job change, an improvement, depends on your willingness to put up with sexual advances or sexual assault. That's one type of sexual harassment. And the other type is where the culture of the workplace, the way people interact with you, may not impact your employment status, but it makes it so uncomfortable or unsafe to work there that you don't feel like you can do your job. So we're going to talk about those two different types in detail now. So that the first that I mentioned there was what we call quid pro quo sexual harassment. Quid pro quo is Latin. That means this for that. It's an exchange. So requests for sexual favors are granted or are put forward in exchange for employment or advancement. So if you want to get hired, you will sleep with me. If you want to get a promotion, you will put up with me talking to you this way. If you don't go on a date with me, you're going to be fired. Or if you don't go on a date with me, you're going to find that you don't get to work very good shifts. That kind of direct exchange for employment or advancement in a company. This is what we think of when we think of like the stereotypical Hollywood casting couch. If you put up with sexual harassment from someone, you will get cast in the movie. If you don't, you won't work in Hollywood again. That's kind of the classic idea of sexual harassment. It's the classic idea of quid pro quo sexual harassment. Quid pro quo sexual harassment is most often what we're familiar with, because most often when there is a big famous trial that's going to court, it's a case of quid pro quo sexual harassment. That is the easiest to note. It's most often specific to specific situations, specific individuals. So if we see cases of this coming forward in the news, it's almost always quid pro quo sexual harassment. So that's what we see and that's what we think of. And that's certainly one type of sexual harassment. If anyone would be willing, please feel free to throw in the chat or unmute yourself and share if you can think of any cases of quid pro quo sexual harassment, either in the news, famous cases, or even cases from pop culture, from movies or TV shows, cases of quid pro quo sexual harassment or people who have committed that. I see Roger Ailes. Yes, absolutely. Any other examples we can think of? Harvey Weinstein. Yes, that's probably the most famous example that we can point to these days. Again, with the Me Too movement, a lot of that centered around Harvey Weinstein. So he is kind of the one we think of most often. He was well known for asking young actresses to sleep with him or sexually harassing young actresses, exposing himself to them. And if they put up with it, he'd cast them in his movies. If they complained about it, if they wouldn't sleep with him, if they went to the police, they never worked in Hollywood again. So that's probably one of the most famous cases. He is in jail right now for that. David Letterman is a case most people are not familiar with, but it was well known in the entertainment industry that he would date and sleep with his interns. And if you were dating or sleeping with David Letterman while you worked for his show, you were much more likely to have your material featured on his late night TV program. You were much more likely to get hired full time. You're much more likely to advance in your career. That's quid pro quo sexual harassment. You couldn't, you were more likely to succeed if you were in a relationship with David Letterman. Roger Ailes, like someone said, that he was a leader of Fox News. He was well known for creating quid pro quo sexual harassment threats when he was hiring. One of the Fox News TV personalities that he was hiring, I believe her name was Kelly Barnes, reported that when he was interviewing her, he told her, and this is a direct quote, "If you want to play with the big boys, you have to lay with the big boys." So female TV personalities on Fox News knew at best they had to put up with an offensive work environment or offensive jokes from Roger Ailes and his cohort, and at worst, sexual assault. And then if we're thinking of pop culture, my favorite example is Professor Callahan from Legally Blonde, who tells the main character of Legally Blonde, Elle Woods, that if she wants a summer internship with his program, he would like to see how far she's willing to go, with the implication that will she sleep with him in order to get a summer internship. And of course she doesn't, and she succeeds all on her own because this is a movie and that's how things happen in Hollywood. But we see that threat, that implication of, if you are willing to sleep with your law professor, maybe you'll have better opportunities in your career. That's quid pro quo sexual harassment. The other type of sexual harassment is hostile work environment sexual harassment. And that is much more common, which makes it much more difficult to point out and to look for. Hostile work environment sexual harassment is any unwanted sexual conduct, even without a quid pro quo threat, that creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. So this is where there may not be that threat of, if you don't allow me to do something, I will fire you, or if you won't sleep with me, you won't get the job. There's not that threat necessarily involved, but there is a culture in the workplace, or there is behavior that's tolerated from specific individuals that makes a workplace where you feel afraid, where you feel undervalued, where you feel objectified, and where you can't perform at your highest capacity. So that does not necessarily have to be a boss like we would expect with a quid pro quo sexual harassment, or someone in a position of leadership or power over you. It could be your colleague. It could even be someone who works under you. Anyone or any group of individuals who are saying or doing things that make you feel uncomfortable, and that's not being handled by the workplace. So some examples of what can contribute to a hostile work environment are things like inappropriate questions, especially for your LGBTQIA+ staff. One of the options in the poll at the beginning was asking a trans colleague about whether or not they've had gender affirmation surgery. We might not think that that seems like a very big deal or like a very bad thing, but would you ask your cisgendered colleagues about their genitalia? No, of course you wouldn't. We obviously know that's not appropriate in the workplace. The same goes for your trans colleagues. You can't ask those questions. That could make someone feel very uncomfortable, or could make someone feel like they're being othered or objectified in the workplace to discuss the kind of topic that you would never discuss with someone who is not trans. Similarly, you think I've had situations with friends where people have felt very comfortable asking them inappropriate questions that, again, they wouldn't ask a straight colleague. I have a friend who is she's a lesbian pastor, and after church one day, one of her parishioners asked her how she and her wife have sex. And she said, well, how do you and your wife have sex? And well, that's not appropriate. It's not appropriate for him to ask her that either. So sometimes we might not realize it, but the questions that are being asked are not questions that we would ask someone who is straight or cisgendered. And that could be creating a workplace where an LGBTQIA+ staff member feels othered or objectified. Suggestive comments, emails, or notes, lewd jokes or sexual anecdotes in the workplace, displaying sexual images, posters, or graphics. Of course, that could be something as obvious as sharing pornography with a colleague, or sending out pornographic images on work email, but it could be that sexy fireman calendar in your office that you might just think is funny, but for someone else who's coming in and who has to meet with you in your office or see that in your office, that could make them feel very uncomfortable. Sharing inappropriate images or videos with coworkers, even off the clock. That example in the poll of, rating your coworkers, whether they're hot or not, in a group chat after hours with other work colleagues. That's still not appropriate, even though it's not on work time, because those kinds of attitudes and opinions will trickle into what's happening on the clock. Sexual comments, even if they're framed as compliments, or even if you think they're compliments, or sexually suggestive statements. Again, the intention doesn't have to be to sexually harass someone. Often with hostile work environment, it's someone who thinks, I'm just making a joke, I'm just having fun, I'm not intending to sexually harass you, I'm just creating a fun work environment. However, if someone else feels uncomfortable because of what is happening, your intentions don't matter anymore. The impact of your actions is what matters. So when we think of hostile work environments, can anyone think, again, this is not something that often comes to a trial or to court, so we may not have legal examples, but there's a lot of this in pop culture. Can anyone think of any examples of a hostile work environment that's been portrayed on a TV show or in a movie? Michael Scott from The Office, Matt Lauer, The Anita Hill case, the morning show, absolutely. The White House in real life, absolutely. Yes, those are all really great examples. The Anita Hill case is clearly a case of workplace, of a hostile workplace. Matt Lauer clearly made people uncomfortable. He had a button in his office to lock his door from the inside. I mean, I can't think of any reason you'd need that other than making someone feel very unsafe in your presence. And of course, the classic example that I always think of is what someone said, Michael Scott in The Office. For anyone who's watched this show, there's a running joke where, I mean, aside from all the other wildly inappropriate things Michael Scott says and does and other people say and do in the workplace, there's a running joke where Michael Scott will take a completely innocuous statement in the workplace and add "that's what she said" on the end to make it inappropriate. So he'll, someone will say something like, "This job is really hard," and he'll say, "That's what she said." So it turns a very normal office interaction into a sexual interaction. And again, he's just doing it to be funny. He's not doing it with any malicious intent he's the hero of the show. We're not supposed to think he's a bad guy. However, someone working in that office could very clearly feel so uncomfortable that they couldn't do their job or feel very objectified. I don't know how it wasn't a bigger plot line throughout the 9 seasons of the show of just the millions of times that the company should have been sued for sexual harassment and hostile work environment. I'm going to show one more quick video that highlights a real life example of hostile work environment in a workplace. This is from the Democratic debates a million years ago when we were still debating who would be our candidate for, or who would be the Democratic candidate for president, and Michael Bloomberg was still in the race. He had an interaction where he was asked about non-disclosure agreements in his company, non-disclosure agreements related to workplace harassment and sexual violence in the workplace. And I just want to listen to how he responds to that and what he seems to feel about these allegations of sexual harassment in his workplace at Bloomberg News.
Senator Warren, you've been critical of Mayor Bloomberg on this issue.
Yes, I have, and I hope you heard what his defense was. I've been nice to some women. That just doesn't cut it. The mayor has to stand on his record, and what we need to know is exactly what's lurking out there. He has gotten some number of women, dozens, who knows, to sign non-disclosure agreements, both for sexual harassment and for gender discrimination in the workplace. So, Mr. Mayor, are you willing to release all of those women from those non-disclosure agreements so we can hear their side of the story?
We have a very few non-disclosure agreements.
How many is that?
Let me finish.
How many is that?
None of them accuse me of doing anything other than maybe they didn't like the joke I told. And let me put.
So just a really quick video there, because I just want to highlight what he said there right at the end. We have a small number of non-disclosure agreements, none of them against me. Maybe someone just didn't like a joke I told. And that is so often the attitude around hostile work environment sexual harassment is, I just told a joke. Maybe someone didn't like the way that I behaved, but it wasn't like I was doing anything bad. As if creating a hostile work environment, an environment where someone could feel so uncomfortable because of the jokes you told that they are suing your company, as if that's not a big deal. We really need to shift that mindset that, well, quid pro quo sexual harassment is wrong, of course, but I was just telling a joke. That's not the same thing. Hostile work environments are much more common, and they're much more often what leads to people leaving your company. That's what leads to you as a good employee who puts in good work, who's really contributing to your nonprofit or your organization's success, not feeling comfortable enough to stay. We need to root out that hostile work environment, those attitudes, those jokes, those little things that we could ignore. We need to root those out, because that's what leads to some of these real big problems. So when we're reporting abuse, if any type of sexual harassment is happening in the workplace, you have a few different options to report. Of course, you can report internally to whatever kind of human resources department your organization uses, whether you have a human resources officer on site, or whether you utilize another company or another HR option, you can report internally, report to your supervisor, report to HR, report to the executive director or to the board. You can move things up the ladder in your own company. If that isn't working, if that doesn't feel safe to you, if you don't feel like they would handle that, you also have external reporting options. You can report at the Illinois, at the state level or at the federal level. You can report through IDHR, the Illinois Department of Human Resources. Their website for information on that is illinois.gov/DHR. You can also call the Illinois Sexual Harassment and Discrimination Hotline, 877-236-7703, and get information on how and where to report sexual harassment at a state level. You can also report at the federal level by filing a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That hotline number is 1-800-669-4000. Both that state and federal hotline are not the final reporting location. However, that is the number you would call, explain a little bit about your situation, and they would send you to where you need to report, give you the information on how to best report that in that situation. At the federal level, you have 180 days from the incident you're reporting to file that claim. At the state level, you usually have about 300 days. However, you can file a complaint both at the state and federal level. And in fact, in most cases, whichever one you report to first, you can ask them to file a report. If you report federally, you can ask them to file a state report. If you report at the state level, you can ask them to also file a federal report, and they'll handle both. So I would recommend, as you're thinking about when you would want to report, if you try to stay under that 180-day time limit, you're more likely to be able to get a report at both the state and federal level if you're thinking about reporting externally. But you do have 180 days from the incident you're reporting to report at the federal level and 300 days to report at the state level. So those are some of your reporting options. It's also important to note that if you do make a report of sexual harassment, you are protected legally from retaliation. Employees are protected from retaliation after reporting discriminatory behavior. Employees cannot be terminated or otherwise adversely affected as a consequence for reporting abuse. So if you make a report to your HR department about abuse that you're experiencing, or a way that a colleague or a supervisor is making you feel uncomfortable, and you come in the next day and find out that you've been fired, you have a legal case for retaliation on your hands. If you come in, you file a report with Human Resources, and you come in the next day and find out you've been written up for not meeting, for a workplace, you're not dressed appropriately for the workplace. And then the next day, you're written up again for not being dressed appropriately in the workplace. And the next day, you're written up for not being dressed appropriately in the workplace. And the fourth day, you're fired. Well, that's a pretty strong coincidence that right after you file a report, you start getting written up for something else that's never been a problem before. You probably have a case for retaliation. It doesn't even have to be being fired. You might find that you're simply being moved to less desirable shifts. You reported sexual harassment in the workplace, and now you're being asked to work every overnight shift, or you're being asked to work all the weekend shifts. Or you were working a full 40 hours a week, but now you're only being scheduled for 5 or 10 hours a week. Or everyone goes out after work to have drinks and they discuss important workplace matters. And you find that your invitations to those, they're just not coming anymore. So you're out of the loop on what's happening in the company. That could be a case of retaliation where you're being denied access to information you need to do your job. And it comes directly after you've reported sexual abuse. Keep track of those things that you think might be retaliation, because you could have a case for that as well. And then just a few important considerations as we think about abuse. Physical harassment is often just the tip of the iceberg. Again, that quid pro quo sexual harassment is often what we see, but there's really a lot going on under the surface. By the time a quid pro quo case comes to trial, by the time someone like Harvey Weinstein is on trial for sexual harassment, there's a whole culture of abuse that's been going on. And in most workplaces, you're going to see this culture of abuse behind the scenes far before, or even in the case where there is no physical harassment happening. There's a lot more going on under the surface. And that can be things like offensive sexual teasing, inappropriate jokes being tolerated in the workplace, relentless pressure to go on a date. If someone, you ask someone out, workplace romances are okay, but they say no, and you keep pressuring them. Offensive remarks about people's bodies, even gender discrimination, like implying that women don't belong in the workplace, or that working mothers can't do as good of a job as single women or as men in the workplace. So those kinds of remarks, those kinds of jokes, those kinds of attitudes are always below the surface when there is physical harassment happening. And when there's not physical harassment happening, oftentimes those kinds of things are still there. And if we think about this iceberg metaphor, it's not the ice that we could see above the surface that sank the Titanic. It's all that stuff that was happening underneath. Power dynamics are also important to consider. Harassment cases are almost always born out of a power imbalance. Now, that is often a supervisor to someone they're supervising. That's the power dynamic that leads to harassment, but it could also be power dynamics based on gender. If you're in a historically male-dominated field and you're a woman, even if you're the supervisor, that power dynamic could lead to offensive or inappropriate or abusive behavior. If you are a med student and the only person who supervises you is one doctor, and they hold the power of your ability to advance in your career in their hands, and they're harassing you, it's really hard for you to do anything about it. So we need to be proactive about thinking, where is there a situation where power is very imbalanced in our workplaces? If someone needed to report, are there multiple options? They don't just have to go to one person who may be the person who's harassing them. How do we make sure that we're being proactive to reduce risk and we're creating as many opportunities for people to report as possible? And then finally, that consideration that we need to get involved. Harassment persists not because people don't know what it is or don't see that it's happening, but because we turn away from it, because we assume that it's not our problem, or that I don't need to say anything, or it's not that big of a deal. We need to get involved. If we see something happening, it is our responsibility as bystanders to say something about that. So when we think about bystander intervention, we need to think about the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. These are the 5 ways that we can get involved if we see something happening in our workplace. And that can be anything from an unwanted physical touch or a quid pro quo kind of sexual harassment situation that we learn about, but it could also be, we hear Jerry from accounting making an inappropriate joke to Sam from HR. It could be that we hear Samantha talking about her weekend plans in a way that is clearly making Jonathan uncomfortable. We hear these things, we see these attitudes, we need to get involved. So the first D of bystander intervention is direct intervention. We see something happening and we go get involved and say, knock it off. I see that Jordan is asking Joe out on a date, even though Joe has already said no 3 times. And Jordan is making Joe feel really guilty about that. So I go up to Jordan, who's my friend, and I say, Jordan, knock it off. Joe said no. That's the end of it. Or I overhear Sally make an inappropriate joke, and I say, Sally, that's really not okay in the workplace. You really need to not say those kinds of things. So directly get involved. This is the easiest when it's someone who's on your same level and when it's someone you have a connection with, like a friend that you can say, hey, you're being a creep, knock it off. This may not be as comfortable of an option if it's your supervisor, if it's someone you don't know very well. So you don't have to directly intervene, but that's one option, to get involved and say, knock it off. The second D of bystander intervention is distract. Cause a distraction to give that person who's feeling uncomfortable a chance to get away. I think of this, if you're in a restaurant and your server is being harassed by a line cook, you drop a bunch of plates, causes a distraction that gives them a chance to get away. Or you notice that one of your fellow employees is stuck in a conversation where they seem really uncomfortable. You pick up the phone and say, oh, hey, Sally, I've got a call on line 1 for you. Can you come over here and take it? Give them an excuse to get away, give them a distraction. The third D is delegate. Pass the buck up the line to the person whose job it is to handle it. You see inappropriate behaviors, you overhear inappropriate comments, you see inappropriate attitudes happening in your workplace. Tell the person whose job it is to handle that, whether that is the supervisor of the person who you see acting inappropriately, or whether that's your HR department. Make a report and tell them, Becky, I see these things happening in the workplace. You're our HR rep. It is your job to deal with this. Report that, pass that up the line to the person whose job it is. The fourth D is delay. So you don't have to intervene at the moment, but I see that Sally feels really uncomfortable in a conversation she's having with Samantha. And, a couple hours later when Sally and I are alone together, I say, hey, I noticed that you were really uncomfortable. Are you okay? Or I noticed that client was really cornering you in that situation. You looked uncomfortable. Do you want me to help you? Do you want me to help you go to HR and make a report? Is there anything you need? Are you okay? Check in with that person after the fact and just see, Hey, I noticed that something happened. Are you all right? Do you want any help? Just ask if they need any support. And the 50 is document. Just take notes of what's going on, whether it's you directly who's being affected or whether you're seeing someone else. Make notes about that. Send emails, time-stamped emails saying, 3 times today, I overheard Michael Scott make inappropriate comments that created an overly sexualized environment in a situation that did not need to be sexualized. Send that email to your HR director, even just send that email to yourself if you have a time-stamped record of what's going on. Or if you have colleagues who are sending inappropriate messages after work hours, take screenshots of that. Document that so when someone is ready to go to HR or someone is ready to make a report, we have that documentation that they can use to back up their case. Those are the ways that we can get involved. And again, get involved sooner. Don't wait until someone is physically attacking someone else. Get involved sooner when we hear those attitudes, when we hear those jokes, when we hear those comments. Because if we can nip it in the bud and make it clear that those attitudes and that culture is not tolerated in our workplace, guess what? We won't have the physical attacks. We won't have the physical harassment. We'll nip that in the bud right away. So really, when we're thinking about this, the keys for success in a workplace, and this is not rocket science, this is just the basics. Encourage civility. Treat people the way you'd want to be treated. We're going back to kindergarten here, folks. This is not a brain surgery. This is not rocket science. Just treat people with respect and empathy. That's really all we have to do. Encourage reporting. If something is going on, say something, do something, and be a positive bystander. Intervene sooner. If you see something happening, check in with that person, get involved in the situation, make a note of it, make sure the right people know what's going on, make it clear that we don't tolerate this in our workplace. We're not going to put up with this. This is not okay. This is not what we're about here at our organization, here at our nonprofit. We don't put up with this. So we've got about 5 or so minutes left in our time here. I know there's been some stuff going on in the chat that I think Mary Beth has been responding to, but are there any other questions that I can answer at this time in the last few minutes that we have left? Please feel free to chat them in, or if you would like to unmute yourself and ask them, that is fine as well.
Linnea, so
Yes.
I will just interject that. So the conversation in the chat, I was responding directly to someone. So if you could perhaps just answer and talk a little bit about the difference between, or sort of the overlap and the differences between sexual harassment and sexual abuse. So where, so the difference between a criminal case and a civil case.
Yes, absolutely. So there is, it is a crime in Illinois to physically assault someone. It is a crime to sexually abuse someone. That often hinges on, the ability to show a physical case. It's rare that we see a criminal case related to what someone is saying, or although there are certainly non-physical cases that can go to court, especially if someone is saying things in a way that's documented. They're texting, they're emailing inappropriate things. There's any threats of blackmail. We see this a lot, especially with nude photographs in the workplace. If someone has those photographs of you and is using them as a way to threaten you, of course, that is both a crime and an act of sexual harassment in the workplace. So it's not a clear cut and dry boundary. There can certainly be both, and you certainly have both options available to you if you're looking to press criminal charges against someone for harassing you in the workplace, if they're making you feel unsafe, if there's any sort of physical threat, if there's any sort of blackmail threat, if there's any sort of physical harassment that's happening, you can certainly press criminal charges, but you can also press civil charges, or press civil charges if you think that's an avenue you'd be more interested in taking. And if you're wondering more details about which would work better for your case, or which you're more interested in pursuing, I would encourage you to contact Safe Passage, and our legal advocates can walk you through the various options that are available to you and potentially connect you with free or low-cost legal representation for a case like that. And as you noted in the chat, Mary Beth, there is no statute of limitations on sexual abuse crimes in Illinois. So starting from January 1st of this year, if you were sexually abused or sexually assaulted or sexually experienced sexual abuse in the workplace or in any other situation, even if it is a decade later, you still are able to press criminal charges in that case. So there's no time limit anymore going forward for cases. Yes, and I know for many of us, this isn't something where we're speaking from personal experience, but it's good to have an idea when these things, if they were to come up or to come up from someone else, to have that idea, but it really depends on the details of the case. So what I would recommend in any case is to reach out to an organization like Safe Passage for more information on your specific case, what options are available to you, what options are going to be the best for you going forward. But yeah, there is a lot of overlap between civil and criminal cases. Other questions? I will also put up Safe Passage's contact information. I know Mary Beth did put that in the chat earlier. However, just a reminder, if you want to get in touch with us, we are available 24 hours a day by phone. We're also available 24 hours a day by text. You can get in touch on either of those lines in the moment if there is a crisis happening and you're looking for information or support, if something has been triggering and you want to talk with someone, but also if you're looking for services or looking for more information, you can certainly call, get connected with a counselor, a legal advocate, learn more about our processes and our services, or even get referrals to other services that you might be looking for, especially legal representation or other forms of support that you might need if you're looking to make a report against a workplace, either current or former. And if you're interested in finding more information or learning more, of course, you can keep up with us on our website, safepassagedv.org, or follow us on any of the social media channels. And we post our contact information there regularly, so you can connect with us there as well. Any other questions that are coming in? Safe Passage is a nonprofit, yes. Our mission is to prevent violence in DeKalb County, as well as support survivors. I'm off the top of my head, I'm not going to be able to. The mission of Safe Passage is to Mary Beth, can you remember our mission off the top of your head? Our goal is to offer support for survivors through advocacy, intervention, and prevention in DeKalb County. So we do work with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, as well as provide prevention training to professionals and community members. And we do work with an offender intervention program as well to work to end violence at its source. Any other questions I can answer? Anything else from you, Ben? Thank you, Mary Beth, for putting our mission in the chat box there. The mission of Safe Passage is to promote the right of all to nonviolent and abuse-free relationships through advocacy, intervention, and prevention in DeKalb County.
Thank you so much, Linnea. I'm going to just jump in here and apologize for not being able to be with you as you kicked off the webinar today, but wanted to introduce myself to the group. My name is Ben Bingle. I'm the director of the DeKalb County Nonprofit Partnership, and just so grateful to have people like Linnea and Mary Beth to lead us through a session like this, and fortunate to have an organization like Safe Passage locally that has this level of expertise and the willingness to share this information with us. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And more broadly, thank you to everyone who joined us today. I believe it was mentioned earlier that we'll be sending a follow-up evaluation via email, so you can give us feedback about today's session. We'll also include the webinar recording, and we'll send a subsequent email to each of you that has your certificate of completion. Ask that you give us a few days on that. It may take a little while to get those certificates out, but our goal is to do that in the next week. So in closing, we encourage you to visit DCNP.org, follow us on Facebook for upcoming trainings and opportunities, to sign up to our newsletter, and so on. Our next webinar is on December 2nd, and this is our last webinar of 2020. It focuses on nonprofit finances, and specifically how you can better understand your current financial position, and offering tips about how to communicate your financial story with stakeholders in this very unusual year, where we know that 2020 is going to have an asterisk next to it. So we hope you'll join us for that webinar. You can learn more about that on our website and register for that today. So once again, thank you very much for attending, and a big thank you goes to Linnea and Mary Beth for sharing their time and expertise with all of us today. Thank you, and take care.